The orange bandana was still in Darnell Tiny Mac Williams's pocket when the bullet hit him. Los Angeles, California, Western Avenue and 52nd Street, July 19th, 1993, 10:15 in the evening. The temperature had dropped to 72 degrees after a day that hit 95, and the streets of South Los Angeles were active with the kind of energy that always preceded violence. Darnell lay on the sidewalk outside Randy's Donuts, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest, while his cousin Raymond tried to stop the bleeding with his bare hands, and people scattered in every direction. The shooter's car, a green Honda Accord with tinted windows, had already disappeared south on Western Avenue, swallowed by traffic and darkness. Nobody would tell police what they saw. In this neighborhood, talking to cops was suicide, and the people who witnessed the shooting understood that this wasn't random violence. This was a message. The orange bandana in Darnell's pocket meant something. In a city where gang colors were sacred, blue for Crips, red for Bloods, with a few exceptions like the purple Grape Street Crips, orange was a declaration of independence. It meant the Hoover Criminals, the gang Darnell and Raymond belonged to, were done being just another Crip set taking orders from older, more established crews. Orange meant they were their own entity now. The question bleeding out on the concrete alongside Darnell was whether the Hoovers were strong enough to survive that independence. 2 blocks away, in a converted garage behind a house on 51st Street that served as the Hoover Criminals' unofficial headquarters, 32-year-old Dante Big D Morrison got the call. The voice on the other end was panicked, breathing hard, trying to explain that Tiny Mac had been shot, that it looked bad, that an ambulance was coming but probably too late. Dante hung up without responding. He looked around the room at the 8 other Hoover members present, younger cats in their late teens and early 20s, boys who'd grown up in the neighborhood and who'd joined the Hoovers because it was the only family that mattered on these streets. They'd all heard his half of the conversation. They knew what the silence meant. "Who did it?" asked Jerome J. Rock Patterson. He was 24, built like a linebacker, with a scar across his left eyebrow from a fight when he was 16. J-Rock had been with Dante since the beginning, and back when the Hoovers were still part of the larger Crip alliance, before the split that had made them targets for everyone. "Don't know yet," Dante said. "Could be the 60s. Could be Brims. Could be anybody who thinks we're weak enough to test." "We gonna handle it?" Dante didn't answer immediately. This was the question that separated leaders from followers, strategists from hotheads. The easy answer, the one J-Rock and half the room wanted to hear, was yes. Get guns, find out who did it, kill them tonight. Make it clear that shooting a Hoover meant death, swift and certain. But Dante had been doing this too long to believe easy answers worked. He'd seen crews destroy themselves through emotional retaliation that brought police heat and started wars they couldn't win. The Hoovers had gotten where they were, large enough and organized enough to break from the Crip alliance, because Dante understood something most gangbangers never learned. Violence was a tool, not a response. You used it when it served a purpose, not when you were angry. "We're going to find out who did it first," Dante said. "Then we're going to figure out why. Then we decide what to do." J-Rock looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could speak, Dante's phone rang again. Different number. He answered and listened for 30 seconds, his face expressionless. "Darnell didn't make it," Dante said after hanging up. "Dead before the ambulance got there." The room erupted. Voices overlapping, guns being pulled from waistbands, threats shouted at walls. Dante let it go for 10 seconds, then stood up and raised his hand. Yet the room gradually quieted. Darnell was my cousin, Dante said, his voice flat and cold. I knew him before any of you. I brought him into this. So don't think I don't feel what you feel. But we do this smart, or we don't do it at all. Understood? Nods around the room. Grudging acceptance from J-Rock. But Dante could feel it. The pressure building, the expectation that violence would come, the test of whether he could lead or whether someone else would step up and take the Hoovers in a direction that felt right, but would destroy them. The orange bandana was supposed to represent independence, but independence meant being alone, and being alone meant every other gang in South LA saw an opportunity. The violation hadn't started with Darnell's murder, and it had started 6 months earlier when the Hoovers made the decision that would define their future and paint a target on every member's back. January 1993. A meeting in the same converted garage, but with different energy. Back then, there had been hope instead of rage, ambition instead of fear. Dante had called together the Hoover leadership, about 15 guys who controlled different sections of the territory, which stretched from roughly Adams Boulevard to Florence Avenue, and from Vermont Avenue to Western Avenue. Several square miles of South Los Angeles that the Hoovers had claimed block by block over the previous decade. The Hoovers had started in the early 1980s as just another Crip set, the Hoover Crips, named after Hoover Street that ran through their territory. Like hundreds of other Crip sets across Los Angeles, they wore blue, threw up Crip hand signs, and paid respect to the older, more established Crip gangs that had founded the Alliance in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But by the early 1990s, the Hoovers had grown larger than most Crip sets. According to LAPD gang intelligence, numbers Dante knew through street sources who'd seen the reports, the Hoovers had somewhere between 800 and 1,200 members, making them one of the biggest Crip sets in the city. Size brought power, and power brought questions about why the Hoovers were still taking orders from smaller, older sets, whose glory days were decades past. At the January meeting, Dante had laid out the case for independence. The Hoovers controlled their own territory. They had their own suppliers for drugs. They generated their own money. The Crip Alliance that had once provided protection and resources now provided nothing except obligations. Obligations to support other sets in wars that didn't benefit the Hoovers. Obligations to share profits with crews that did nothing to earn them. Obligations to show respect to leaders whose only claim to authority was history. We're bigger than most of them, Dante had said. We got more soldiers, more money, more territory. Why are we acting like we're the little brothers? Some of the older guys had been skeptical. The Crip Alliance was sacred, they argued. It was what protected them from the Bloods, from other gangs, from being isolated and destroyed. Breaking away would make them enemies of everyone. But Dante had a counter-argument prepared. We're already enemies of half the Crips. The 60s don't fuck with us. The East Side Crips act like we don't exist. The 8 Trey gangsters started a war with us 2 years ago that's still going. We're Crips in name, but we've been on our own for years. All I'm saying is we make it official. We're the Hoover Criminals. Our color is orange. We don't answer to nobody. The vote hadn't been unanimous, but it had been close enough. The Hoovers would break from the Crip Alliance. They would adopt orange as their color, a middle ground between Crip blue and blood red, a statement that they weren't choosing sides because they didn't need to. They would operate independently, make their own alliances, fight their own wars. The decision had been made in January. By February, the first orange bandanas appeared on the streets. By March, a word had spread through South LA's gang networks that the Hoovers were no longer Crips. By April, the violence had started. Darnell's death in July was the escalation that forced everything into the open, but it wasn't the first casualty. There had been 2 Hoover members shot in drive-bys in May. Both survived, but the message was clear. There had been a confrontation between Hoovers and Rawlins 60s Crips in June that ended with 1 60s member dead and 3 Hoovers arrested. There had been countless smaller incidents: disrespect, challenges, tests of whether the Hoovers could really stand alone. But Darnell's murder was different because of who he was. Dante's cousin. A respected member who'd been with the Hoovers since the beginning. Yet his death wasn't just violence. It was a direct challenge to Dante's leadership and a test of whether the Hoovers would survive their Declaration of Independence. Dante spent the 2 days after Darnell's death gathering information. He had street sources throughout South LA, people who sold drugs, people who ran businesses, people who heard things and remembered them. The information came in pieces, but gradually a picture emerged. The shooters had been Rollin 30's Harlem Crips. The 30s were a smaller set than the Hoovers, but well established, with deep roots in the Crip alliance. They'd been one of the most vocal opponents of the Hoovers' independence, seeing it as disrespect to Crip tradition, and an opportunity to take Hoover territory if the larger set could be broken. Should the 30s leadership, headed by a 35-year-old shot caller named Kenneth K-Dog Williams, had apparently decided that the Hoovers' independence was unacceptable and that violence was the solution. Darnell's murder was meant to send a message. The Hoovers were vulnerable, Dante couldn't protect his own family, and other Hoover members should think carefully about whether they wanted to die for orange bandanas. When Dante shared this information with J-Rock and the other Hoover leadership, the response was immediate and predictable. "We roll on the 30s tonight," J-Rock said. "Hit their corners, light up their cars, kill K-Dog if we can find him. Show them what happens when they fuck with us." Dante understood the impulse, but he also understood that the 30s weren't acting alone. They were backed by the larger Crip alliance, which saw the Hoovers as traitors. A direct war with the 30s would escalate into wars with multiple Crip sets, bringing violence that would decimate the Hoovers, even if they won individual battles. "We're not rolling tonight," Dante said. J-Rock stood up. "The fuck we're not. They killed Darnell. We kill them. That's how this works." "That's how amateurs work," Dante said, not raising his voice. "Professionals think before they move." "Professionals? We're gangbangers, D. We're not running a corporation." "That's exactly what we're running," Dante said. "We got 800 to 1,200 members. We control multiple territories. We move drugs worth millions of dollars a year. We employ people. We have hierarchy. We make strategic decisions. We are running a corporation. The only difference is it's illegal, and the competition kills people." J-Rock sat back down, but Dante could see the tension in every muscle. This was the challenge, keeping guys like J-Rock loyal while making decisions that felt like weakness, but were actually strategy. "We're going to respond," Dante continued, "but we're going to do it in a way that destroys the 30s, without starting wars. We can't win. We're going to be smart." The strategic withdrawal that followed Darnell's murder lasted 10 days. 10 days of silence from the Hoovers while the streets buzzed with speculation about whether they were too weak or too scared to respond. 10 days of Dante's phone ringing with Hoover members demanding action, questioning his leadership, threatening to handle it themselves if he wouldn't. Dante let them talk. Yet he needed time to understand the full system behind the 30s challenge. K-Dog Williams ran the Rollin 30's Harlem Crips from a base on 29th Street between Western and Normandy. According to Dante's sources, the 30s had maybe 150 to 200 members, a respectable size but nowhere near the Hoovers' numbers. They made money primarily from crack cocaine sales, with some robbery and extortion on the side. Standard gang economics. The 30s supplier connection ran through a dealer named Crazy Frank Johnson, who moved cocaine from Mexican sources and distributed it to multiple Crip sets throughout South LA. Frank wasn't aligned with any particular gang. He was purely business, selling to whoever had money. But he had relationships with the older Crip leadership who'd been around since the 1970s, and those relationships gave him influence. The 30s' protection came from their alliance with larger Crip sets, particularly the Rollin 60s, who were one of the biggest and most established Crip gangs in Los Angeles. The 60s didn't necessarily like the 30s, but they saw the Hoovers' independence as a bigger threat to Crip unity than the 30s' violence was a problem. Supporting the 30s against the Hoovers served the 60s' interest in maintaining the Crip Alliance's authority. This was the system Dante needed to understand. Killing K-Dog wouldn't destroy the 30s. He'd just be replaced by another shot caller. Starting a war with the 30s would bring the 60s into the conflict, which would be disastrous. The Hoovers were big, but they couldn't fight multiple established Crip sets simultaneously. The real vulnerability was economic. The 30s depended on drug sales for revenue, which meant they needed customers, corners to sell from, and protection from police interference. If Dante could disrupt the 30s' money flow, he could destroy the organization without the open warfare that would bring other Crips into the conflict. J-Rock didn't understand this at first. During a tense meeting on Day 7 of the strategic withdrawal, he'd confronted Dante directly. "The streets think we're punks," J-Rock said. "Other sets are starting to test us because they see we didn't do nothing about Darnell. We're losing respect every day we sit here." "Respect isn't what people say," Dante replied. "It's what they do. Let them talk. When we move, they'll understand what real power looks like." "And when do we move?" "When I say so." J-Rock had walked out of that meeting, and Dante knew he was close to losing him. But rushing because of internal pressure would be even worse than waiting. He needed the plan to be right. The plan came together on Day 9. Dante called a meeting, not with all the Hoovers, but with key leaders who controlled different aspects of the organization. J-Rock for enforcement, Darnell's younger brother Terrell for the younger soldiers who wanted revenge, and critically, a guy named DeAndre Dre Harris who managed the Hoovers' drug operations. Dre was 28, quiet, analytical, the closest thing the Hoovers had to a financial officer. He didn't participate in violence, but he understood the economics better than anyone. "The 30s make about $50,000 a week from crack sales," Dre said, laying out what he'd learned through street sources. "Most of that comes from two corners, one at 30th and Normandy, one at 29th and Western. Those corners have been theirs for years. Good customer traffic, reliable income." "Can we take them?" Dante asked. "Take them? Yeah, we got the soldiers. But holding them is different. The 30s will fight, and if we're openly at war, other Crips might back them." "What if we don't take the corners? What if we destroy them?" Dre looked confused. "How you destroy a corner," Dante explained. The 30s corners were valuable because they were open-air drug markets where crack users knew they could buy reliably. But what if those corners became too hot? Too much police attention, too much violence, too unreliable for customers? What if buying crack from the 30s became dangerous and inconvenient instead of easy? "We don't attack the 30s directly," Dante said. "We make their business impossible to operate. We hit their corners with violence that brings police. We rob their customers. We make their spots so hot that users go somewhere else. And while we're destroying their income, we offer an alternative. Hoover Corners 3 blocks away where business is safe and reliable. J-Rock shook his head. That's going to take time. People want blood now. People are going to get blood, Dante said. But it'll serve a purpose. Every bullet we fire is going to cost the 30s money and reputation. And when they're broke and weak, then we finish them. The coalition Dante assembled over the next 2 days included people whose involvement would surprise most Hoovers. The obvious participants were enforcement, J-Rock, and about 30 soldiers willing to engage in the violence required. These weren't the youngest. Most reckless members, but guys in their 20s who understood that gang warfare was about discipline and purpose, not just shooting randomly and hoping you hit someone. But Dante also brought in Dre and the drug dealers who ran Hoover Corners throughout the territory. These guys would be responsible for absorbing the 30s customer base once their corners became unreliable. Dre's job was making sure Hoover operations could handle the increased volume without depleting supply or raising prices that would send customers elsewhere. More surprisingly, Dante approached a guy named Curtis C. Money Lewis, who ran an independent crack operation in the territory between Hoover and 30s control. C-Money wasn't affiliated with any gang. He paid taxes to both the Hoovers and the 30s for the right to operate in the borderlands. Dante made him an offer. Support the Hoovers' move against the 30s by refusing to sell to the 30s' displaced customers. And when it's over, C-Money could operate in former 30s territory without paying taxes to anyone. "Why would I help you?" C-Money asked when they met at a neutral location. "The 30s leave me alone. Why would I make enemies?" "Because the 30s are finished," Dante said. "Whether you help or not. The only question is whether you profit from it or you stay where you are. I'm offering you expansion into their territory tax-free. All you gotta do is not help them and send customers our direction." C-Money thought about it for a day before agreeing. The value he brought wasn't just refusing to help the 30s. It was information. As a neutral operator, C-Money heard things from multiple sides. He could tell Dante when the 30s were planning moves, when they were getting desperate, when they were vulnerable. The final piece of the coalition was the most controversial. Dante approached a crooked LAPD officer named Rodriguez, a cop who'd been on the Hoover's payroll for 2 years, providing advance warning of raids and occasionally looking the other way when Hoover members broke the law. Dante paid Rodriguez $5,000 to ensure that any 911 calls reporting violence at the 30s corners got priority response, flooding those locations with police presence that would make drug sales impossible. When Dante explained this to J-Rock, the enforcer was skeptical. "We're paying cops to come faster? That's your plan?" "We're paying cops to come to the 30s corners faster," Dante clarified. "Not ours. Every time we hit one of their spots. Police are there within minutes. Customers scatter, dealers get arrested. The corner goes cold for hours. Do that enough times and customers stop going there because it's not reliable. And when Rodriguez gets caught taking money from us, then we stop using him. But until then, he's another weapon." The coalition was assembled by day 12 after Darnell's murder. Dante had enforcement, economic infrastructure to absorb the 30s business, an independent dealer who would refuse to help the 30s, and a corrupt cop who would weaponize police response. The strategy was set. The only question was whether it would work before internal pressure from Hoover members demanding immediate violence destroyed Dante's authority. The strategy unfolded in 3 phases over 4 weeks. Phase 1 was pure harassment. Starting on a Friday night in early August, Hoover soldiers began hitting the 30s primary corners with drive-by shootings. Not mass shootings designed to kill everyone present, carefully targeted attacks that wounded dealers, scattered customers, and generated 911 calls. Rodriguez ensured police response was immediate. Within 15 minutes of each shooting, the corner was flooded with cops, yellow crime scene tape, and an environment where drug sales were impossible. The first week saw 7 such attacks on the 2 main 30s corners. 3 dealers were shot. All survived, but all were hospitalized or too injured to work. Multiple customers were robbed while fleeing the violence. The corners that had been reliable 24/7 drug markets became intermittent and dangerous. Customer behavior changed predictably. Crack addicts need reliability. When their usual source becomes unreliable, they find alternatives. Hoover dealers 3 blocks away from the 30s corners began seeing increased traffic from customers who explained they were avoiding the violence. Dre ensured the Hoovers had enough supply to meet demand, expanding operations smoothly while the 30s' revenue collapsed. The 30s' response during week 1 was exactly what Dante expected. More violence. They retaliated against Hoover corners with their own drive-bys, shooting up Hoover spots and killing one Hoover member, a 19-year-old named Deshaun. The death hurt. Deshaun had been a good kid, reliable worker, someone's son and brother. But strategically, the 30s' violence helped Dante's plan because it generated even more police attention, making all gang activity more difficult, and forcing the 30s to spend resources on attacks that didn't address their fundamental problem. They were losing money. Phase 2 began in week 2 with targeted robberies. Hoover members began following 30S dealers, identifying when and where they counted money or moved cash to stash locations. Then the Hoovers hit these money movements, robbing the 30s of their revenue before it could be secured. According to C-Money, who was hearing the 30s' internal discussions, the gang lost approximately $30,000 over 10 days to these robberies. A devastating blow to a crew that was already losing revenue from disrupted corners. The robberies forced the 30s into a defensive posture. They had to increase security around money movements, pulling soldiers from corners to guard cash, which further reduced their ability to serve customers. They had to change procedures constantly, making operations more complex and less efficient. And they had to explain to their supplier, Crazy Frank, why they were paying late and requesting credit to maintain inventory. This was where Phase 3 became critical. Dante had sent a message to Crazy Frank through intermediaries. The message was simple. The 30s are a bad investment. They're broke, they're losing territory, they're probably going to be destroyed in the next month. Any money you extend to them is money you won't see again. The Hoovers, meanwhile, are growing, profitable, and willing to pay cash for larger shipments if Frank is interested in expanding his customer base. According to C-Money, who'd heard it from one of Frank's associates, the supplier was considering it. Frank was business first, not loyal to any particular gang. If the Hoovers were a better customer than the 30s, he'd switch suppliers without hesitation. But week 3 brought the complication Dante had worried about. The Rollin' 60s Crips stepped in. The 60s intervention came in the form of a meeting request. A neutral location in territory neither Hoovers nor 60s controlled. Just talking, they said. Trying to resolve the conflict before it got worse. Dante knew this was dangerous. The 60s were one of the largest and most established Crip sets in Los Angeles. If they decided to back the 30s militarily, the Hoovers would be fighting a war on multiple fronts that they couldn't win. But refusing to meet would be disrespectful and might trigger exactly the war Dante was trying to avoid. J-Rock argued against going. It's a setup. They're going to kill you or force you to back down. Either way, we lose. If they wanted me dead, they'd shoot me on the street, Dante said. This is them trying to handle it politically before it becomes their problem. I have to hear them out. The meeting happened at a park in neutral territory. 360 shot callers met with Dante and J-Rock. The lead 60s representative was a guy in his 40s named Malcolm, who'd been with the 60s since the 1970s and who carried the authority of decades in the gang. "This thing with the 30s needs to stop," Malcolm said. "You're disrupting business for everyone. Police are all over South LA because of your war. That hurts the 60s, hurts the 30s, probably hurts you too." "We didn't start it," Dante replied. The 30s killed my cousin because we left the Crip Alliance. That's on them. The Crip Alliance is bigger than any of us," Malcolm said. "You leaving disrespects everybody who built this. The 30s were wrong to kill your cousin, but you breaking away created the situation." "So what are you saying? We rejoin the Crips and everything's forgotten?" "I'm saying you stop this war with the 30s. We'll handle them for you. Make sure they understand they crossed a line. But you stop the violence, and we all go back to business as usual." This was the offer. The 60s would discipline the 30s internally. Dante would get justice for Darnell through Crip Alliance politics rather than war. And the Hoovers would stop their economic warfare that was destroying the 30s. In exchange, the Hoovers would remain Crip-affiliated and accept the larger alliance's authority. Dante looked at Malcolm and saw what the older man was really offering: a return to the old system where the Hoovers took orders, paid tribute, and stayed small. The orange bandanas would go away. The independence would end. The Hoovers would be just another Crip set. "No," Dante said. Malcolm's expression hardened. "Think carefully. You're not big enough to fight the whole Crip Alliance. The 30s are just the start. We can bring down dozens of sets on you." "Then do it," Dante said. "Because we're not going back. We're the Hoover Criminals. Orange is our color. We run our own operation and we don't answer to anyone who isn't Hoover. That's not changing." Malcolm stood up. "Then you're on your own. And when the 30s come after you with 60s backing them, don't expect mercy." After the 60s representatives left, J-Rock turned to Dante. "You just started a war with the biggest Crip set in LA. We're fucked." "Maybe," Dante said. "Or maybe the 60s don't actually want to fight. They want us to fold without them having to do anything. Let's see if they're willing to back up the threat." The 60s didn't attack, at least not immediately. For days after the meeting, Dante waited for retaliation that didn't come. According to C-Money and other street sources, the 60s were arguing internally. Some wanted to support the 30s and crush the Hoovers to make an example. Others questioned why the 60s should spend blood and money on the 30s war when the 60s had their own problems. The split within the 60s gave Dante the time he needed. Phase 3 of the strategy continued, squeezing the 30s economically, disrupting their operations, stealing their customers. The robberies continued, further depleting the 30s' cash reserves. The harassment of their corners continued, making their drug markets unusable. And then Crazy Frank made his decision. According to Dre, who'd heard from one of Frank's dealers, the supplier cut off the 30s. No more credit, no more shipments, no more supply. The 30s' debts were too high, their prospects too dim. Frank was a businessman, and the 30s were a bad investment. The break came in week 5. K-Dog Williams sent a message through intermediaries requesting a meeting. Not demands, not threats. A request. The 30s wanted to negotiate. Dante met with K-Dog at the same neutral location where he'd met with the 60s. This time, K-Dog came alone, us without backup, a sign of either desperation or surrender. "You win," K-Dog said. "You wanted to prove you could operate independent. You proved it. You wanted to destroy us for killing your cousin. You pretty much did that. We got no money, no supplier, no corners that are safe to work. You want us gone completely, we'll fold the set and scatter. Just stop." Dante looked at the man who'd ordered Darnell's death and felt nothing. Not rage, not satisfaction, not even triumph. Just calculation. "Here's what's going to happen," Dante said. "The 30s stay intact, but you work for us now. Your corners become Hoover corners. Your soldiers answer to Hoover leadership. You still run day-to-day operations, but you pay taxes to us and you clear major decisions with me. You do this, you get to stay in the game. You refuse, well, we keep squeezing until there's nothing left." K-Dog had sat in silence for a long moment before nodding. "We'll do it." The 30s surrender was announced through street channels over the following week. The Rollin' 30s Harlem Crips, a set that had existed independently since the 1970s, now operated under Hoover criminal control. Their corners, their revenue, their soldiers, all now part of the Hoover organization. The message to every other gang in South LA was clear. The Hoovers weren't just independent from the Crip alliance. They were powerful enough to absorb other sets entirely, large enough to fight economic wars that destroyed rivals without the open violence that brought overwhelming police response, organized enough to execute complex strategies over weeks instead of just shooting and hoping. At the new order that emerged in fall 1993 showed the Hoover Criminals as the fastest-growing gang in South Los Angeles. With the 30s absorbed, the Hoovers' territory expanded significantly. The estimated membership increased from around 1,000 to nearly 1,200. Revenue from drug sales and other criminal activities increased by approximately $50,000 weekly, according to Dre's records. Money that was reinvested in expanding operations, purchasing better weapons, and paying soldiers more reliably than other gangs could match. The organizational structure Dante built separated the Hoovers from typical gang operations. Instead of loosely affiliated neighborhood sets operating independently under a common name, the Hoovers functioned with unified command. Dante and a small leadership council made strategic decisions. Regional commanders managed different territories. Specialized roles, drug distribution, enforcement, money management, were assigned to people with specific skills rather than just whoever was willing. This professionalization made the Hoovers attractive to younger gang members from other sets. Why work for a disorganized crew that couldn't protect you or pay consistently when the Hoovers offered steady income, clear hierarchy, and disciplined operations? By early 1994, the Hoovers were actively recruiting from other Crip sets, absorbing members who were willing to switch colors from blue to orange for better opportunities. The conflicts with both Crips and Bloods intensified as the Hoovers grew. The Crip sets saw them as traitors who needed to be punished, and the Bloods saw them as enemies despite the Hoovers not being Crips anymore. The Hoovers fought wars on multiple fronts through 1994 and 1995. Drive-by shootings, murders, territory disputes. But unlike most gang wars that were chaotic and reactive, the Hoovers approached each conflict strategically, targeting rivals' economic infrastructure and organizational leadership, rather than just exchanging violence randomly. The human cost was measured in bodies. Between Darnell's death in July 1993 and the end of 1995, an estimated 40 to 60 people died in violence involving the Hoover Criminals. Hoover members, rival gang members, and some bystanders caught in crossfire. Each death represented someone's son, brother, father, friend. Each funeral left families grieving and communities traumatized. J-Rock was killed in March 1994 in a drive-by shooting attributed to the Rollin' 60s. His death hit Dante hard. J-Rock had been his closest friend in the gang, his enforcer, the guy who'd wanted immediate revenge for Darnell, but who'd ultimately trusted Dante's strategic approach. Without J-Rock, the enforcement side of Hoover operations fell to younger, less experienced leaders who were more violent and less disciplined than J-Rock had been. Terrell, Darnell's younger brother, was arrested in June 1994 on weapons charges. He refused to cooperate with police and received a 5-year sentence. Other Hoover members were similarly arrested throughout this period, with dozens incarcerated by late 1995. The consequences that would eventually define the Hoover Criminals story came not from rival gangs, but from law enforcement. The LAPD gang unit had been tracking the Hoovers since they broke from the Crip alliance. The violence, the expansion, the absorption of other sets, all of this attracted attention. But what really triggered intensive investigation was the Hoovers' organizational sophistication. They operated more like a criminal enterprise than a typical street gang, which meant they were potentially vulnerable to RICO prosecution if the structure could be documented. The federal investigation began in late 1994, though Dante didn't know it yet. FBI agents worked with LAPD gang unit detectives to map the Hoover organization, identify leadership, and document crimes that could support conspiracy charges. They used surveillance, informants, and arrested Hoover members who agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. By 1996, the investigation had gathered enough evidence for indictments. Dante Morrison was arrested along with approximately 30 other Hoover leaders and members. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine, weapons violations, and multiple murders. The government's case alleged that the Hoover Criminals operated as a criminal enterprise engaged in a pattern of illegal activity, making leaders liable for crimes committed by members even if they didn't personally participate. The trial in 1997 presented cooperating witnesses, former Hoover members who testified about the organization's structure, Dante's leadership, and specific criminal acts. The evidence included surveillance photos, wiretapped conversations, and financial records showing money flows. The defense argued that the Hoovers were just a loose affiliation of individuals, not an organized enterprise, but the prosecution demonstrated systematic hierarchy and coordinated operations that contradicted this. Dante was convicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Dre got 15 years. Multiple other Hoover leaders received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The convictions gutted the leadership that had built the Hoover Criminals into one of Los Angeles's largest and most organized gangs. The gang itself didn't disappear. The Hoover Criminals continued operating through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, but without centralized leadership. Yet they fragmented into neighborhood sets that fought each other as much as they fought rivals. The orange color remained, but the organizational discipline that had made them powerful dissolved into chaos. 26 years later, in 2023, Dante Morrison was released from federal prison at age 58, having served 23 years of his 25-year sentence with credit for good behavior. The South Los Angeles he returned to bore little resemblance to the 1990s landscape where he'd built the Hoover Criminals into a force powerful enough to break from the Crip alliance. Gentrification had transformed parts of the old territory. The gang was still active but fragmented, with different Hoover sets operating independently and sometimes warring with each other. The younger generation had no memory of the unified organization Dante had led, and no understanding of the strategic thinking that had made the Hoovers briefly dominant. Dante couldn't return to gang activity. Parole conditions prohibited association with known gang members, and federal authorities would be watching for any violation that could send him back to prison. He lived in a halfway house, worked at a warehouse, and tried to build a life from nothing at nearly 60 years old. Sometimes he thought about Darnell, about the orange bandana that had started everything, about the decision to break from the Crip alliance that had seemed like liberation, but had ultimately led to prison for Dante and death, or incarceration for most of the people who'd followed him. The question he couldn't answer, the question that haunted him in the small hours when he couldn't sleep, was whether it had been worth it. The Hoovers had proven that a gang could transcend traditional alliances, could build organization and discipline that rivaled traditional organized crime. They'd shown that size and strategy could defeat rivals who relied on just violence and reputation. But the cost had been measured in lives. Darnell, J-Rock, Deshawn, and dozens of others whose names Dante could recite from memory. The cost had been measured in years. His own 23 years in prison, plus the hundreds of years collectively served by Hoover members locked up for following his leadership. The cost had been measured in families destroyed, communities traumatized, and a generation of young men who'd joined the Hoovers seeking protection and opportunity, but who'd found prison or death. The legacy of the Hoover Criminals was complex. They'd proven that gang organization could evolve beyond simple territorial violence into systematic criminal enterprise. They demonstrated that independence from traditional alliances was possible if backed by sufficient size and discipline. They'd created a template that other gangs across the country would study and adapt. But they'd also proven that law enforcement eventually prevails against even sophisticated street organizations. The RICO statutes and federal resources that had destroyed traditional organized crime worked equally well against street gangs that operated like criminal enterprises. The Hoovers' organizational sophistication, the very thing that made them powerful, created evidence trails and structural vulnerability that federal investigators could exploit. Dante had led the Hoovers from being just another Crip set to being an independent force in Los Angeles gang culture. He'd built an organization that at its peak controlled multiple territories, employed over 1,000 members, and generated millions of dollars annually. He'd proven that strategic thinking could triumph over traditional gang approaches that relied purely on violence and reputation. And for that success, he'd spent 23 years in federal prison, lost his youth and middle age, and returned to a world where everything he'd built had either disappeared or transformed into something unrecognizable. The orange bandana that Darnell had died carrying was supposed to represent independence and power. In the end, it represented the same thing every gang color represented, a marker of identity that led young men into violence, prison, and early graves, while the system that created the conditions for gang activity remained unchanged. This was the truth of the Hoover Criminals story. Not a tale of triumph or redemption, but a documented account of how intelligence and organization could build temporary power in illegal markets, and how federal law enforcement's systematic approach would eventually dismantle even the most sophisticated street organizations. The strategy had worked. The independence had been achieved. The dominance had been real. And in the end, none of it had mattered. The gang still existed, but fragmented. The leadership was dead, imprisoned, or scattered. The empire had collapsed, and the only question that remained was whether the next generation would learn from the Hoover criminal story, or whether they would repeat the same cycle, believing this time would be different. The answer, based on every pattern in gang history, was that they would repeat it. Because the conditions that created gangs, poverty, limited opportunity, geographic segregation, the drug trade's economics, persisted regardless of how many individuals went to prison or how many organizations were destroyed. Dante understood this now. Too late to change anything. The Hoover Criminals had been bigger than the Alliance, but they hadn't been bigger than the system, and no street organization ever would be.